Welcome to Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. I'm your host, Nicole Davenport. For more than 1,500 years, the walls of Constantinople have stood as a silent witness to centuries of war, conquest, and rebellion. They've survived several huge earthquakes and even a very intense, violent hooligan riot, which emerged out of chariot racing and nearly turned into a war. The original part of the wall was built by the first Greek settlers around the Acropolis. As time went on and the Romans basically stole the joint, the walls were expanded and modified many times over. This fortification system is one of the most intricate of its kinds, not to mention the biggest and most structured out of both ancient and medieval times. And through the centuries, the walls remain. Through the rise and the fall of empires, through the deaths of emperors and the births of sultans, through the destruction, watching. Watching as history repeated itself over and over and over again. And today? Today's no different. Because at the base of this ancient wall, a crowd is slowly gathering. Hushed murmurs and gasps fill the warm air. Some people in the growing crowd are staring at the top of the wall, one hand shielding the evening sun out of their eyes, mouths agape. Others in the crowd look horrified, frozen in place, unable to do anything. And the rest of the crowd? The rest of the crowd are mechanically taking out their phones to film what appears to be an object that's laying on the ground. Show sources can be found on Podbean and Spotify. This episode features a case out of Istanbul, Turkey. While I translated text to the best of my ability, there's always some room for mistakes. If I have made any mistakes, or if you have anything to add, please, please, please let me know in the comments. Thanks. This podcast supports the We Will Stop Femicides platform of Turkey. Content warning. This episode will discuss extreme violence, possible religious abuse, and discussions of self-exit. Listener discretion is advised. Aside from telling this important story, I will be alternately discussing the manosphere online, the political climate of Turkey, and mental health. I also feel that it's very important to relay that I'm not trying to single out the people of Turkey. I'm trying to pick apart the AKP, the Justice and Planning Party, running the country, along with its president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who continue to fail the women of Turkey by their lack of action, not to mention their refusal to resubmit to the Istanbul Convention. Let's get in the sack, shall we? Are incels the new serial killer? The newest boogeyman of pop culture, inspiring fear, fascination, and media frenzy? How serious is this new issue of hateful, misogynistic echo chambers online? Are the groups predatory? Should we be concerned over this cultural shift? Well, to answer your questions, yes, somewhat, yes, and yes. Now, I don't mean the new serial killer as referring to behaviors, but the sensationalized aspect of the phenomenon that are serial killers. Even though the so-called involuntary celibates and serial killers do share a small amount of common ground, such as the hatred and the inability to connect with women, I'd have to say that the rampage killer type is a more accurate comparison, complete with their little manifestos, Both rampage killers and the extremists who identify as incels usually act alone, but enjoy meeting lovely, like minded individuals online in any number of forums and consume extremist content. The incel finds validation, encouragement, and even fandom online within the darkest corners of the internet. Incels seem to feel betrayed by the world for quite a long list of things, to be honest. It's hard to see how anybody could gain anything from being in these incel forums. You might be thinking, but Nicole, what's so bad about support, community, male bonding, even? The echo chamber that it becomes is the problem. The hatred and encouragement of violence against women becomes normalized before a person, especially a young person, even realizes what's happening. A young man who might just be searching for tips about flirting or relationships in general could end up being pushed into more and more extreme content, courtesy of the algorithm gods. Look, I don't know about you guys, but I kind of worry over these online forums that are fueled by hateful, misogynistic rhetoric. Some people insinuate that just talking about this issue gives this type of hate a platform. But isn't it better to know what is happening within these forums? For this reason, I went onto incels.is. What I experienced there was shocking, to say the least, but not really surprising, especially if you've ever been on 4chan. Many people say that beliefs shouldn't be punished. But what if those beliefs slowly build up an ideology which often incites violence against women, like a dangerous cult? Where's the line? We used to fear the creep lurking in the shadows, but thanks to the internet, those shadows are now well lit and frighteningly crowded. To better understand this growing concern over violent misogyny online, which can collide with real life, let's talk about the case that shook Turkey last year. Let's talk about Semih Çelik and the political climate which enabled the atrocities which occurred in this case. In the early 2000s, when Semih Çelik was born, Turkey seemed to be moving in a progressive direction. The party that was in power, and still is in power, the AKP, which stands for Justice and Development Party, initially presented itself as a reformist party that promoted democracy and human rights. This could have been, however, due to their shiny bid for EU membership, in which Turkey had been a candidate for since 1999. I mean, the EU had only just begun negotiations for Turkey's membership in 2005. Couldn't they just hurry up? I mean, how long could the AKP keep up this charade? Plot twist, not long. In 2010, when Semi was around 5 years old, Turkey wanted to further strengthen its bid for EU membership. So they doubled down. They signed the Istanbul Convention in 2011 with hopes to finally prove that they just loved human rights, rule of law, and everything democracy. I mean, live, laugh, choose, right? I feel that it is important to expand a little bit on the Istanbul Convention because it is important in understanding the story. The Istanbul Convention, officially known as the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, is a human rights treaty aimed at addressing violence against women and domestic violence. Key points include prevention of violence by requiring political parties to take measures to prevent violence against women, including raising awareness, educating, and training professionals who work with victims. Protection by mandating the establishment of support services for victims, such as shelters, hotlines, and counseling. And prosecution, which means calling for the criminalization of various forms of violence against women, including domestic violence, sexual harassment, and stalking. But as the plot twist indicated, they were kind of lying, that AKP, because at the same time Turkey was literally instrumentalizing the rights of women to make a good impression on the EU, it was increasingly embracing a more authoritarian and Islamist leaning agenda. Gender equality was just used as a tool, then slowly, quietly packed up into boxes and moved into some random storage unit and eventually traded in for those traditional value structures, aka rigid gender roles. Because motherhood shall be thine woman's primary role. When Semi was 9 or 10 years old, there was kind of a turning point within Turkey due to the Gezi Park protests in 2013. These protests were first environmentally charged due to urbanization, but slowly morphed into a challenge of the AKP's grip on power. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who I will refer to as Erdogan from now on, the then Prime Minister and now President, began cracking down on civil society, including women's rights organizations, immediately after these demonstrations. The government started framing feminism and gender equality as Western imported threats to Turkish values. As if things couldn't get much worse, there was an attempted failed coup in 2016. Semih Çelik would have been 12 or 13 years old. Erdogan used this crisis to purge opposition groups, consolidate power, and shift toward an increasingly nationalistic and Islamic governance style. Organizations for women and LGBTQ plus groups were completely shut down or severely restricted. The AKP aligned itself more and more closely with far right nationalist and Islamist groups who completely opposed feminism. Fast forward to 2021, when Semi would have been about 15 or 16 years old. Turkey completely pulled out of the Istanbul Convention, claiming that it was to protect the Turkish values and prevent LGBTQ propaganda. However, it was obvious that this move was more widely seen as a political strategy, and guess what they did? They shifted focus away from Turkey's economic crisis by creating a, drumroll, culture war. Sound familiar to what's happening in the US? I'm sorry to bore you all with this historical aspect of this story, but I feel it's important to understand the political climate that Semi grew up in. Understanding this socio-political backdrop provides insight into the environment that shaped the perspectives and the actions of the individuals involved, highlighting the potential impact of fluctuating governmental policies and societal norms. This dichotomy may have contributed to the complex social dynamics influencing attitudes toward women and gender relations, making it easier to fall into something like extreme misogyny and incel forums. To this day, Turkey continues on its descent into the right. There is actually a term for this slow process that has occurred in Turkey and is ongoing to this day. It's called democratic backsliding, and it's happening a little bit of everywhere in the world, unfortunately for the rights of women, amongst many, many other things. In 2018, when Semi would have been about 13 or 14 years old, and 2 years after the failed coup attempt in Turkey, by the way, Aldem Çelik moved over to a home in Eyüp Sultan, which is in Istanbul, with Semi, Semi's sister, and Semi's mom, and then began high school, where Semi met İkbal Uzuner. Not long after, he would become infatuated with her. He tried to do whatever it took to get Iqbal's attention, including bringing other girls around in front of her to try to encourage reactions, though it seemed that she didn't feel equally the same as Semih did. She did, however, seem to want to be friends. Known to be somewhat devout around this age, Semih once said to his dad, "Why are you not praying? You're going to hell, you know." I guess that was a good thing? Question mark. Either way, there are many reports that Semih seemed to be somewhat of an introverted kid, often seen frowning or scowling. He was also said to be a loner, uninterested in being around his cohorts, but maybe there were reasons for that. Reasons that would soon enough show themselves. And then COVID happened. And for many around the globe, especially for kids, life changed immensely. After having heard from a teacher that his son had a talent for coding, Adem Çelik bought a computer for 16-year-old Semih around the time when COVID restrictions began. It was around this time that Semih withdrew into his bedroom and he was on his new computer obsessively. He became completely fixated with sites like Discord, where he seemed to find a kind of community there. Who could have known that at least one of the communities that he found camaraderie in was an incel community on Discord, the messaging app? Ah, yes, the so called manosphere, which consists of online communities of men who often use misogyny as a stepping stone to gain a following. There are several of these different online group types under the umbrella of the manosphere, which consist of, but are not limited to, incels, PUAs, which stands for pickup artists, MRAs, which stands for men's rights activists, and also MGTOWs, which stands for men going their own way. Now, it's easy to dismiss incels as that weird, culty echo chamber of the manosphere, filled with angry, bitter men who feel rejected by women and often create strange hypothetical situations to justify their hatefulness towards women. But dismissing them would be a little short sighted, wouldn't it? What if they're not just an isolated subculture anomaly? What if they're an extreme symptom of a much deeper societal disease? A disease that has been there, planted deep beneath the soil of society, like tiny ticking time bombs just waiting to erupt. When Semih began showing those reasons, remember the reasons for that loner behavior? The seemingly antisocial, sometimes unfriendly, but bordering on aggressive behavior, which is possible mental unwellness. Details remain unclear regarding Semih Çelik's upbringing and personal life, but I wonder a few things. Were there any indications of the McDonald triad? For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, the McDonald triad assists as an identifying factor for people who may show signs of antisocial personality disorder. It consists of bedwetting, attraction to fire, and harming animals. It is a huge precursor to a very violent individual. Also, Semi's age was consistent with the same age where schizophrenia can begin to show itself. Was the ever changing political climate, which had changed even more drastically in the recent few years, sending a powerful message to Semi? A message of existential pointlessness, neatly lined with blatant misogyny? While we may not know the exact answer to that question, my guess is that it absolutely did. This misogynistic way of thinking becomes a normal part of life when ingrained into everyday society. I imagine that this is especially so when the then Prime Minister of Turkey, says things like, quote, "You cannot put women and men on an equal footing. It is against nature. They were created differently. Their nature is different." End quote. Thanks, Captain Obvious. Yeah, we're quite different, but certainly not disproportionate or unequal. Laura Bates, author of Men Who Hate Women, From Incels to Pickup Artists, The Truth About Extreme Misogyny and How It Affects Us All, says it best on misogyny within society. Quote, "In a society in which misogyny and violence against women are so widespread and so normalized, it is difficult for us to consider these things extreme or radical because they are simply not out of the ordinary. We do not leap to tackle a terrorist threat to women because the reality of women being terrorized, violated, and murdered by men is already part of the wallpaper." End quote. Adem, Semih's father, had said that whenever he would try to enter his son's room, the computer would be shut down immediately, as if to hide what he was doing on there for all those hours he was online. It didn't help that Semih had his computer completely password protected and allegedly encrypted as well. So we know that Semih wasn't receiving any real pushback at home for his shady internet behavior. But again, I do not know all the nuances of living within a Turkish society. And I do know, however, that his parents did seem desperate to help when those signs of mental unwellness showed up to say hello. Adem later regretted purchasing the computer for Semih because it felt as though his son had become addicted to his online life and lost himself to whatever he was doing on that thing so much. Not much was known about exactly what happened during this time that Semih was becoming completely immersed into some of the darkest corners of the internet until after the horrendous atrocities he would commit. We returned back to Semih's third year of high school when a guidance counselor called to home to let his mom know that he was to leave a boy in his class named Seitan alone. He had apparently been provoking this boy in some way, to the point that the counselor felt that a call home to the parents was necessary. A little bit before the call from the guidance counselor, Semih began to have kind of a nihilistic attitude towards life, saying things like, "Life is empty." And after the call, he also did not want to continue his school anymore. When asked why, he deflected the question asking, "Why? So I can become a scientist or something like that? And what would that mean?" Which may have been referring to the downward spiral that was, and is, so long as it heads in the same trajectory, collapsing economy and education system, not to mention the ever-shrinking field of anything scientific in Turkey. Remember democratic backsliding? Or maybe it was just indifference. Anyway, Semi's parents even tried to convince him to study abroad. Meanwhile, Semih's obsession over Iqbal was growing and major signs of increasing mental instability began to appear. To make matters worse, Semih began using drugs sometime around this time, after the pandemic. His parents said that his change in behavior and personality made it obvious that he was using drugs. The harassment of Iqbal began around the same time as with Seitan. Hassan, Iqbal's dad, confirmed that Iqbal and Semih had been together for a little while. Eventually, Hassan noticed his daughter's increasing unhappiness. Semih seemed to be able to get inside of her head. Iqbal began trying to pull away, tried to disengage from Semih's toxic behavior. As we often see with intimate partner violence, it's as though Semih was doubling down on stalking behavior when it became obvious that Iqbal maybe didn't feel as strongly as he did. I cannot tell you whether or not the two were intimate, but from my extensive research, translations, and all, they were at least close enough for Semih to begin manipulating Iqbal, romanticizing self exit amongst other very dark things. He cranked up the emotional abuse and the manipulation to about 10. If you will recall what the Istanbul Convention did, remember, it set up a system to help track violent behaviors such as emotional abuse or stalking. But Turkey had done away with that in 2021 in favor of protecting this family based morale bullshit that Turkey kept talking about in this nationalistic way, courtesy of that democratic backsliding. On March 1st, 2022, Iqbal's mom called Semih's home with huge concerns that Semih had been coercing Iqbal into going with him to self exit. She said, "Your son has brainwashed my daughter. It seems as though they have planned to self exit together." Somehow, Iqbal was able to disengage with the situation and avoid it altogether. Semih went on to attempt his own life that very evening by trying to stab himself in the heart. He was taken to the hospital for treatment and then to a psychiatric hospital, which he stayed at for roughly 3 weeks. During this 3 week period, Semih did as he was instructed as an inpatient and seemed active in his own treatment. When he was released, though, he refused to take the medication that was prescribed to him. Again, no one except his parents seemed worried about this, though nothing further was done. Semih would have a total of that one self exit attempt, 5 hospital visits due to psychiatric disturbances, and each time he was released back into the wild, along with the professional opinions of the doctors at that hospital that he was A-OK. He also disappeared 2 times, causing his parents to file a missing person report. After Semih's mom realized how bad this could get, she did something that may be hard for you or I to understand because we don't live in Turkey. She put the weight of the problem onto Iqbal's family by telling them to try to get Iqbal away from Semih because he was dangerous. Basically telling their family to move away, which is precisely how you'd think it would be in a country that continues to weave misogynistic male supremacist propaganda throughout its society. Life is pretty much 100% male centered, and this, whether directly or indirectly, promotes impunity for offenders. They obviously understand that the law is in their favor, and so absurd amounts of violence against women is the result. And I think Semih's mom was trying to do good. It isn't like they had a system in place to deal with violence against women. It is a country that is classified as not free, according to the website freedomhouse.org. And the country is deeply misogynistic, so unfortunately, it kind of makes sense in that way. Either way, Hassan, Iqbal's dad, pulled her out of the school that she went to along with Semih. I wonder if this was when he really decided to drop out of school. Maybe it wasn't the incident with the boy, Seitan, but more that he had nothing to do, no one to provoke any longer. And it just wasn't fun anymore. His life was changing a lot. Iqbal remained friends with Semih even after this for a short amount of time, and Iqbal's psychological state continued to worsen. So Hassan booked an appointment for Iqbal to see a therapist. This was incredibly helpful for Iqbal. It seems as though she was able to break away. "Is there something I can get for you to make you feel better?" Hassan asked Iqbal after she began therapy. "Yeah, Dad, I would love to have a cat. Please," Iqbal told her dad. Photos of this fat, gray little cat can be seen on a few of Iqbal's online photos. She began to show signs of healing, thanks to the emotional support her family showed her, no doubt. The relationship between Iqbal and her parents began getting better and better. After some time, It seems as though Semih and also his mom made sure that Iqbal's family knew that Semih had a new girlfriend and now he wouldn't be bothering them. This is just wild to me, entertaining this idea that they're being helpful by covering up the problem, basically. I'm not ignoring the fact that Semi's parents did try to get him help multiple times, and we're told time and time again that he was fine. Boys will be boys. It's all right. Don't sweat it. But it wasn't all right. Not by a long shot. Because Semi was still trying to keep in contact with Iqbal, new girlfriend and all, though everybody figured there was no more communication between them. But alas, he had to feel like he could still exert control over her, seemingly to feel good about himself. This new girlfriend was Ayşenur Halil. She had gone to the same high school as Semih and Iqbal. In fact, they were all in the same grade. Ayşenur's family were not aware of this relationship between her and Semih, it seems. At the time of the incident, Ayşenur was a beautiful second-year student in the Department of Media and Visual Arts at Istanbul Medipol University. She had a keen interest in graphic design. It has been speculated that Semih treated Ayşenur exactly the same way he treated Iqbal, using coercion and stalking to try to control her. Although all three of them knew each other from high school, it is unclear how Iqbal and Ayşenur felt about each other around this time. It seems pretty obvious to me, anyway, through photos, that they remained friends. Now, during this time of dissolution, with college seemingly off the table, Semih decided that he wanted to become a butcher. The business that he had worked for didn't have anything bad to say about him. This job is allegedly how money was made to purchase drugs. But there also seemed to be an obsession with the knives. A little while later, late 2023, Semih ended up quitting his job as a butcher for reasons unknown. It wasn't too long after that Semih's creepy drawings in his room caught his dad Adem's eye. He asked Semih, "What are those drawings about?" To which Semih answered, "You wouldn't understand, Dad. Our generation's mindset is different." And that was that about that. But more on that in a bit. It seems as though the tension and mental unwellness growing inside of Semih was becoming more apparent at this time. Adem claims to have attempted to remove his son's butcher knives out of the room, to which Semih became enraged and told him to get off of them. They were his. He was quite hostile about it. Adem was worried that if he tried to take the knives, that his son might get upset to the point where he could maybe hurt himself. It was possible that he was afraid of his son, so he let the knives be. Existential questions began around COVID, questions such as, where did we come from? And why did God put us here if he knew we would die? Followed by almost threatening questions later on, closer to the time I'm talking about now. He would ask in a nonchalant but also somehow arrogant way, "How should I kill you, Dad?" So things seemed to be escalating quickly. One night, Adem could feel a draft throughout the house. He noticed that it was coming from Semih's room. He reached out to the doorknob, and as he opened the door, he saw his son staring out the open window, and it was really cold outside. So he walked right over to the window to close it, but Semih stopped him, saying, "Wait, don't. Look out there. What do you see?" "I can't see anything, son. It's dark." "You don't see what I see," Semih had said. Adem also asked his son about the self-exit attempt at one point, telling him that self-exit is a sin. To which he replied, "That's not true. No one could know me. let alone judge me. October 4th, 2024, Semih and his father were the only ones at home. Semih had recently returned home from a trip to Ankara with his mother to help his sister move into her college university area. His mom decided to stay in Ankara a little bit longer, but Semih seemed to have a different plan. That morning, Adem left the house to go to work at around 5:45 a.m. CCTV cameras would later catch Semih at a bakery near his home, where he was heard asking, "How do I look? Is it good?" Eventually, he met Ayşenur in front of a grocery store in the area and then over to his home. This was not something out of the ordinary, Semih's dad would later say. Adem called Semih that afternoon to check on him. He instructed his dad, "Do not come home because Ayşenur is here," indicating that he wanted privacy. His mom would also video call him at around 11 o'clock a.m., also to check in on him, to which she claims that everything seemed fine with Ayşenur and Semih both. Nothing out of the ordinary seemed to be going on. No one could possibly have known, though, that shortly after that call, Ayşenur would be dead. Details of exactly what and why are a bit unclear regarding the murder of Ayşenur Halil. But you're probably like, what was Semih's motive? Why did he do it? Were any others involved? Well, what is known is that sometime after the two arrived at Semih's house, possibly in the early afternoon, Semih had received a call from each of his parents separately in which they checked in on him. But I wonder, did that upset him? Did it set him off? Trying to find rhyme or reason in this case is futile. For reasons known only to Semih Çelik, at approximately 15:30, Semih slit Ayşenur's throat very deeply, and it was unknown exactly when, if it was before or after the main injury, that he sliced off Ayşenur's tongue and placed it onto her mouth. As though she could sense something awful was happening to her beloved daughter, Ayşenur's mom called her phone, to which Semih answered. He told her, "Your daughter is at school." Semih also made a call. Well, not a call exactly, a message, but not from his phone. Remember how I disclosed earlier that Semih, Ayşenur, and Iqbal went to the same high school and that they all knew each other? That Ayşenur and Iqbal seemed to have remained friends. It was Iqbal's phone that Semih messaged from Ayşenur's phone, asking her to meet him at the Wall of Constantinople, the Adornekapi Tower section in Fatih. This wouldn't have been completely out of the norm for Ayşenur to do. Next, Semih called the police and coldly told them what he had done. Then he fled his home, the scene of the crime. He started walking toward the walls of Constantinople. He could be seen walking up to the wall and around the corner, where he disappears up to a metal door of sorts. Upon entering that metal door, there was an area which looked to be used by people who were unhoused and people who used drugs. What we would call a squatting area in America, though I have a feeling maybe that word probably isn't used so much anymore. A few moments later, Iqbal can be seen on CCTV walking toward the Edirne wall, the same exact path that Semih had taken, completely unaware of what just occurred to her friend. Then she also disappeared around the corner and eventually through that metal door that opened up to a darker world. and also, tragically, to her death. A short amount of time later, Semih can be seen at the top of the tower, the part of the Great Wall of Constantinople. Exactly what he was doing on top of the wall could not yet be seen, but it was clear that, by this point, he had murdered Iqbal. But he didn't just murder her. He put his skills as a butcher to use, which makes me think that becoming a butcher was a part of the plan all along. Part of his twisted fantasy that he forced these two girls to be a part of. Semih had decapitated Iqbal. During this time, Iqbal's mom had called, to which someone answered, but it wasn't Iqbal. A male voice said, "Don't worry, your daughter is in safe hands." Of course, this made Iqbal's mom panic. She quickly called back, but someone else seemed to answer the phone this time. The person informed that this phone was at the bottom of the tower, the Edirne Tower, which was a part of the Great Wall of Constantinople. That it must have fallen from the top, and he gave directions to come pick it up. Uzuner, Iqbal's dad, called a third time, and the same man answered as the second time, saying that he would only release the phone to the phone owner's mother. Now, call me crazy, but this feels planned. It almost feels as though Iqbal's family was kind of summoned to the tower as a way to maximize the pain and damage as much as possible. Like the whole thing was carefully orchestrated. Wouldn't the phone have broken? How could it survive such a fall? I have included a few photos on the Great in the Sack podcast page on Instagram if you're interested in taking a look at how far up these towers go. As Iqbal's mom and dad arrived to the wall, they noticed that crowd forming and that some people were staring up at the wall. They wanted to go up to the tower to see if Iqbal was up there and also to be like, "Why did you drop your phone?" But that metal door seemed blocked off by people. As their eyes followed the gazes of those in the crowd staring up at the top of the tower, they spotted Semih Çelik sitting in a part of the tower. Their hearts sank. "Where's Iqbal?" she screamed up to him. And as she began to feel a mixture of fear and anger, she noticed an object soaring through the air, landing nearby them on the ground. It was their daughter's head. People in the crowd became angry. Iqbal's mom started screaming her daughter's name over and over. People yelled at Semih, "Now you should die. Jump." He just sat there on top of the tower, calm and almost motionless, void of any emotion or empathy. It appeared as though a rope was connected to his body in some way, and then connected to other parts on either side of him. The rope that veered off to his right was probably attached to something sturdy within the tower. Then it looked as though the rope to his left was attached to something in the next atrium or opening over. As he stood up, it became obvious what his next move was. He was going to jump, which he did. And I don't recommend you watch the video. I didn't attach it because it's out there. You can search it if you want, but it's brutal. Police and paramedics swarmed the scene. It quickly became obvious that Semih had dismembered Iqbal's body because tied to the rope attached to himself were her hands. Her body was found to be cut into 5 sections. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where people will try to bring in a satanic panic theme. Not everyone, of course, but those who are obviously looking for reasons of why and how this could happen. Remember how I told you about the artwork in Semih's room? Well, during the investigation, authorities found a disturbing sketch, a charcoal-drawn picture that was a very close depiction of the way that Iqbal was stabbed and dismembered. I have included a copy of this on the Instagram site for the podcast. It doesn't look very religion inspired, shall we say, but maybe an idea of what someone might think a satanic picture might look like. What I see, however, is someone who is sick and had an obsession with dismemberment, even up to the point where they got a job as a butcher. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist, this is just my opinion. I also see that now there was some premeditation involved. A lot of premeditation. While all this was happening, Adem Çelik would receive a call from his wife that the police were at their home and that he must go there now. This is when he would discover that his son had taken another life along with his own in a very violent way. While at his house talking to the police, he would find out about Iqbal's murder. Within the many investigations I looked through, I would say there was a few reports of people saying that the whole Çelik family was a little bit different, maybe a little unorthodox, a little quiet. People seemed to think that they were very cold. In the aftermath of the brutal murders of Halil and Uzuner on October 4th, 2024, the Turkish government imposed a temporary media blackout on the case. This censorship led to limited reporting on the incident, sparking public outrage and discussions about freedom of information. The media blackout was met with a ton of criticism, as many believed it hindered public awareness and discourse on the pressing issue of femicide in Turkey. Social media platforms became the primary outlets for sharing information and expressing dissent, with hashtags like hashtag Turkish women are in danger gaining traction to highlight the severity of the situation. Critics argue that such measures not only suppress essential conversations about societal issues, but also impede efforts to hold perpetrators accountable and drive meaningful change. Despite the temporary media restrictions, the severity of the crimes led to widespread public outrage and demonstrations across Turkey, with citizens demanding stronger measures to combat femicide and protect women's rights. In reaction, President Erdogan acknowledged the severity of the issue and indicated a commitment to addressing the growing concerns about femicide and women's safety in the country. However, many people doubt this since they often say one thing, giving their grievances and their sympathy to the crimes. But the AKP party shows a different agenda by the choices that they make, including pulling out of the Istanbul Convention. I mean, that sends the biggest message of all, doesn't it? Istanbul Maripol University staged a protest over the murders of Iqbal and Ayşenur. Their signs, written in English and in Turkish, said, quote, "We are here for all women who have not been heard. We want to live. You, me, us, we're each other's remedy. Stop violence, not women. We will not surrender to fear. And don't touch women and children." Humeira Unsalan, a second-year student at the Department of Media and Visual Arts, and who shared a desk with fellow student Ayşenur Halil, gave a huge call to action, stating, quote, "We reject the mentality that ignores and even kills those who are different from themselves, those who are weak. Today, as Medipol students, we are addressing our state leaders. We don't want to bury another Ayşenur. We want to see them in school." The two brothers of Ayşenur were completely confused and caught off guard. They say they had no clue who Semih was, and even wondered if she had been blackmailed or heavily coerced into meeting up, because Turkey had a security breach a couple years back. Wait, let's quickly unpack this. A few years back, and probably still, Turkey requires its citizens to upload all of their personal information onto a portal, which was breached. Tons of information, including phone numbers, addresses, bank account information, and even email addresses, were basically stolen. And the people who stole it began using this information in order to blackmail people and coerce people, mostly minors, due to their inexperience with con artistry, to do crime, hurt themselves, or even their pets. They can even commit SA through this process. So, back to the story. It would have been something somewhat common for a young girl to be coerced in this way. The two brothers had also never heard of Iqbal. It is possible, of course, that Ayşenur would never have told anyone in her family due to the inexplicable shame of premarital relations, I imagine. But I'm only speculating here. The brothers also relayed that Ayşenur was very introverted and loved being at home with her two cats. Upon discovering that the perpetrator, Semih Çelik, had connections with online communities identifying as incels, Turkish police began monitoring these groups more closely. This move aimed to prevent potential future incidents stemming from similar ideologies. They would go so far as to ban Discord from Turkey altogether, due to an array of harmful groups that existed there, including those con artists I spoke of earlier. That is somewhat meaningless, however. If you can get the right VPN, you can still get onto Discord in Turkey. So, what did it really do? Some might argue that it just made older people feel safer who don't understand the nuances of Discord. Instead of addressing the root causes of violence against women, they focus on controlling online spaces, as if shutting down a website is a sustainable solution. The Turkish government seems to have a pattern, though, of suppressing platforms that exposes issues rather than dealing with these issues themselves. In this case, rather than reinstating the Istanbul Convention, which provided a legal framework for protecting women from domestic violence, they instead targeted Discord after the murders, as if erasing evidence of extremist groups was more important than preventing femicide in the first place. It also fits into a broader pattern of censorship over reform, blocking websites, restricting media, and punishing activists instead of confronting misogyny, honor based violence, and radicalization. Basically, the government was quick as hell to shut down a Discord server where these ideas spread. But when it came to reinstating legal protections for women, literal dead silence. It's all about optics, after all, not real change. It is obvious that the government is much, much more concerned with hiding the problems than solving them. Not too long after the crimes, a manifesto video was discovered, if you can really call it that. In the video, Semih Çelik says, quote, Iqbal, I wanted to say goodbye to you, especially. I'm finally dying. Sorry for what you've been through because of me. You don't have to be afraid or worried anymore. It's completely closed. I hope you have a normal and peaceful death. But there is something that I need to tell you. When I came to see you yesterday, it was to kill you. I want to take away a life before I die. And it was more important to me that the life I took was yours. To gouge out your heart, your beautiful eyes, but you already know about these things. I waited for you under the apartment for hours. If you'd come out, you'd be dead. But God helped you. I'm really happy that I held back because you would have haunted me from the other side. End quote. This didn't have that usual cruel tone that the few manifestos which I've listened to feel. It was hopelessly narcissistic in the way it sounded to me, like he was romanticizing this horrible act of violence and that he chose her for this and that God intervened. So it's a lot of magical thinking, a lot of narcissistic elements to the video, in my opinion. So, which came first, the ideology or the incel? I've done quite a bit of research for this episode, including a scary deep dive into the website incels.is. And as I said, it was pretty awful, but I can also understand that it's a space for men who feel outside of society and unaccepted to congregate and vent. A large amount of incels are autistic and neurodivergent to an extent. I'm also hoping that there are moderators that are watching for patterns of the encouragement of violence. I mean, isn't the manosphere just an extreme symptom of something much more deeply rooted in society and also accepted by society? And at the end of the day, whether Semi was an incel, a narcissist, or even a sociopath, the ideology behind his actions, the entitlement, the control, the misogyny, has existed long before the internet gave these men a space. Incels did not invent male violence against women. And does deplatforming these spaces actually stop the violence? Or does it just push these guys further underground? And if the root cause is misogyny itself, not just the online spaces, then what is the real solution? Because even if every incel forum disappeared tomorrow, the beliefs that drive men to harm women would never just vanish. No doubt the platforms aren't really helping anything, but maybe energy should be focused more on the root cause. The sites might make people who have the most potential to commit violence and would most likely do it with or without these platforms feel a little bit more self righteous in doing so by having all of their comrades' support. But they're certainly not the cause. The manosphere is huge, so rather than focusing on censorship, the real question is how do we stop misogyny at its source? I guess I'm just worried that this is a case of everyone being distracted from what is really going on at the root of the problem, kind of like what's happening in America as we speak, and many places over the world for that matter. It is easy, very easy, to get caught up in the shock factor or make it about extreme individuals. But we must look at the big picture, how all these ideologies are just branches of the same toxic tree that is the patriarchy. Inceldom is just a subreddit off the main Reddit. I mean, it's just a difference of many expressions of the same core belief that some people, usually white men, are entitled to power and control over others. Whether it manifests as incels blaming women for their loneliness, nationalists blaming immigrants for their struggles, or religious extremists using it all, comes back to men maintaining hierarchy and control. So, was Semi an incel? Or was he just using that world as a stage for his own self importance? If you ask me what my opinion is, I'd say Semi was going to find a way to do something like this, incel community or not. Though I do believe that the ideology of the incel coincides a lot with what he seemed to portray self exit ideations, harassment, and obsession with the two girls. Did he actually absorb the ideology, or was it just another tool for his own grandiosity? It feels as though he was looking to really go out with some sort of bang. He also seemed to have an obsession with playing out his drawing into reality. He was a person with a lot of problems. His parents appear to have done a lot to try to help. Was it enough? I guess that's a matter of opinion. It is possible that he was also a product of his environment. After all, he saw huge limitations placed on women's rights during his life. With the democratic backsliding came huge amounts of impunity for men who broke the law, especially who committed crime against women. There were no real consequences, and if there were, they were usually overturned. All I'm saying is that can shape the way a person develops psychologically. So, where does this leave us? How do we protect ourselves in a world where men like Semih exist who feel entitled to women's time, attention, and lives? As women, we shouldn't have to live in fear, of course, but until the world changes, we have to be knowledgeable and smart about our safety. Trust your gut. If someone makes you feel uncomfortable, even in small ways like not respecting your boundaries or showing up at your house unannounced or, love bombing, don't dismiss it. It's better to be cautious than to give the benefit of the doubt as we have been taught to do since birth as women. It's also important to keep records. If someone is harassing or stalking you, document everything. Save messages, screenshots, and timestamps. It may help if you need to seek legal action also. Okay, this next one's important. Exit relationships if you sense danger when trying to leave someone. Seek help. Groups like domestic violence hotlines can help with safety planning. And now, what can we do as a society? One thing we can do is to call it for what it is. We have to stop dismissing misogyny as boys being boys or harmless online talk. The pipeline from hateful ideologies to real world violence is real, and we need to take it at least somewhat seriously without letting it take over our lives, of course. We can also start educating young men. Boys need to be taught emotional regulation, respect, and consent from an early age. This isn't just about individual parenting either. It's about changing the way our entire culture treats masculinity. To start somewhere, I'll go so far even to say to try to influence the young men in your vicinity, and I mean like family, kids of friends, without making any enemies, of course. It does start with us. And finally, we need to support organizations that are fighting gender based violence, groups and other women's rights organizations who are doing the work, but they need awareness, funding, and support. The We Will Stop Femicides platform of Turkey is a fantastic site, and I've linked it in the show notes. Since it's very difficult to accumulate data in Turkey, since they're not a free, transparent country, to figure out how many women are dying from gender based violence every year, this group takes it upon themselves to gather information and put out the numbers on Anit Sayach, which is Turkish for memorial counter. It can also be found in the show notes. What are your thoughts about this episode? Do you think that incel communities are dangerous, or do you think that we should worry more about the root problem? Let me know in the comments. Also, if you have any questions or suggestions, you can reach me at greatinthesackpodcast@gmail.com or at the show's Instagram account. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, stay vigilant, stay vocal, because silence is complicity. See you next time in the sack. Bye.